Monsters do have their place. In the zoo, in your nightmares, in the deep, in your favorite horror movies. But not in your living room. Or
We see the light.
What are these giant mutations?
Horror, as a form of cinematic entertainment, has kind of lost its way. I think beyond the expected indie film standouts like The Babadook and It Follows recently, it's been pretty obvious the genre is being dragged to some sort of creative purgatory, till another surprise subgenre pops up and the horrible consumerist cycle starts anew. Saw showed up in 2004 and consequently sent torture porn into the mainstream. Then it took about a decade for that subgenre's dead body to wash ashore in the form of the human centipede, which thankfully got us all to finally ask what the hell we were doing with our lives. So now we're waiting in the valley for the good stuff to piss down and form into drinkable water again. It always seemed to me that gaming would eventually be the place that horror found its true calling. Once technology could allow for more immersive techniques, I assumed there would be no better way to induce fear. But that never really happened, or it hasn't yet. It's a strong genre nonetheless. We've already seen some horror classics pop up in gaming, but it's certainly not a powerhouse genre like it is in films. People aren't willing to spend $60 to be uncomfortable, and when you think about it, games that purely rely on horror can't last long, and have severe diminishing returns. They have to either rest on cheap prices where they can be short and evocative without upsetting the consumer, or they have to heavily borrow from other genres to house and soften the pure uncut Colombian terror they want to push onto the consumer. It's pretty damn hard to make digestible, tasteful entertainment from something that appeals so directly and wholly to a single emotion like fear. Almost always, you're forced to wrap the horror in action-adventure gameplay, with wildly inconsistent results. This was the plight of Visceral Games, who saw a gap in the market and wanted deeply to fill it. They wanted to make a third-person horror game set in a sci-fi universe and release it into the same market that Gears of War was surely going to retain complete control of. By making some fascinating and contextually brave design choices, the first Dead Space found huge success. What follows in these videos will be a detailed look at the Dead Space series, broken into 3 parts, with one video dedicated to each game. I'm sorry for breaking it up, it's just to make the project a little more manageable for me. I'll only be covering the main trilogy, and while I'll take cursory looks at the narrative in the games and how narrative drives the game world, these videos will mainly focus on the successes and failures in Dead Space's gameplay systems, its user interface, and the design of the game's environment, weapons, and enemies. The first Dead Space opens with a faint white title card obscured by scan lines and static. It's striking, an abrasive first moment for a game that came out of nowhere in 2008. As it all fades in, you're cleverly introduced to the main characters of the game before you begin the approach to the space station Ishimara. It's a gorgeous shot, and the vague exposition provided by the 2 characters speaking in the center of the frame creates a number of important questions for the player to answer. The game is driven by this anxious curiosity, and the choice to have the player introduced to the game world in this manner is great and very grounded in the conventions of the horror films the developers of Dead Space clearly hold so dear. But unlike most of its inspirations, the game doesn't waste much time letting the tension build. Within 10 minutes of starting the game, 2 of your crew members have been brutally killed, and Isaac is forced to sprint down a strobe-lit hallway with a group of humanoid freaks in pursuit. In a few quick moments, the game illustrates just how unfit for this situation Isaac is. His sprint is oafish, and the act of controlling him is cumbersome and slow, making the player feel even more helpless and scared in moments of high stress. He's a working man, not a soldier. His skill set is pragmatic, which is in turn reflected in the game's main systems and how the player interacts with them. The game's user interface is the most immediately apparent example of this design theme. It's stylish and suitably functional, so that's nice, but it's also diegetically implemented, which means that it actually exists in the game world. It's simply a tool that someone in Isaac's position would use, and it's presented in a fashion that never pulls the player out of the moment. There's an intense dedication to immersion in the game, and the UI in horror games can kind of act like a shield for the player to hide behind or to instill false confidence. So Dead Space runs in the opposite direction. The game never pauses when you're surfing through your inventory or looking at your map. It all just projects in front of Isaac in real time. I especially love the game's method of displaying health, a depleting bar on the spine. For this UI to find success in the game, there had to be a strict set of rules for the interface to exist under. Otherwise, it would negatively impact the flow of the game and irritate the player when trying to do things that would be simple tasks in other games, like opening doors. So everything works under conditions that the player quickly gets used to. Interactive elements glow blue and white, while red indicates something that is interactive, but is currently locked or deactivated. I'm colorblind, so no matter what, stuff like this is kinda hard, but the way this was handled in the game worked surprisingly well for me. Sadly, navigating these menus isn't the best. The map screen is pretty awful. It's obvious they put a ton of love into it, and with a bit more work it would be serviceable, but it never got there. And the little pop-ups that indicate items on the ground can also get lost off-screen or just lost in the chaos of the game. I think for better or worse, the awkwardness of sorting through the menus sticks with the game's insistence on the player never getting fully comfortable. There are some concessions you have to make when deciding to limit the visual cues you give players in the game world for the sake of things like a diegetic UI. I can't imagine the amount of hair these guys lost when playtesting the game, and it's kind of unbelievable that it made it to stores without a total dumbification of its more creative design choices. When you're not making some indie game and you have a few $1,000,000 on the line, it's hard not to make your game, for lack of better words, the dumbest player. It often leaves me searching for things that seem out of place, clearly only added to better guide me through the game. Selective lighting to draw the eye, enemy and item placement, sound cues, and such can be used to drag the player from place to place, and it can feel kind of unnatural at times. But more often than not, there's just a big arrow on screen telling you where to go. The developers of Dead Space's answer to this was the ability to drop down a line that could guide you through the environments. It's a constant trump card in your hand if you ever get lost, but you can tell the game would probably work better without it. There's this self-assurance that stuff like that guideline gives players that just doesn't belong in a horror game. Dead Space would be longer, more immersive, and terrifying if they fixed the map and made you fumble around in it in real time when trying to navigate the ship. Maybe if the hard difficulty restricted this ability it would be better. I also understand that I could self-impose this restriction, but that never really feels right to me. Nevertheless, the most important takeaway is that the user interface stays off-screen as much as possible, which focuses the effectiveness of the environmental design and inspires exploration. The game relies heavily on the player's curiosity, and with a slow-moving character, the complete lack of an intrusive UI, and a completely new universe created for the game, all the elements for successful exploration are evident here. The developers want you to read the scribbles on the wall and poke and prod around the game world. The levels are clinically constructed, and the architecture is industrious for the most part, just like a ship of its size would be. Each section of the ship that you crawl through is put together in a manner that makes sense, and there are these touches of life that paint a picture of how the ship looked before everything went to hell. The billboards, notes, warning signs being juxtaposed by blood-drenched scrawlings is pretty standard horror fare, but it's done exceptionally well here. There are these wordless stories told throughout the game world. You encounter a bathroom at one point, covered in blood and bodies, and leading up to that you're walking through a starkly lit and shockingly clean hallway. You see some blood splattered on the wall and turn the corner to see this horrifying scene of bodies piled over each other and decaying alone in this bathroom. After poking around for a little while, you're attacked by the game's smallest enemy, which jumps from a toilet. You can only imagine these people had locked themselves in the bathroom before being attacked from the inside and slaughtered. The developers put some items in there too, so if you want to get immersed, you've got this brutal little story, but if you're in it for the action, your time doesn't feel wasted. But more than just furthering your knowledge of how bad things were on the ship, some of the unnecessary details can ground the player even deeper in the game world. As you enter the mining ward, you see a large billboard with someone pointing at their back at the health monitor that the people on the ship wear and that Isaac wears, and it says, "Watch each other's back. Safety begins with teamwork." This is both a warning that enemies are going to be found in larger numbers, and a tool to heighten the feeling that this is a real place. This casual mention of a fictional device is stuff I really love. The areas where minimum wagers worked are covered in these attorney-recommended workplace propaganda posters. Just like in the real world, the higher-ups are terrified of litigation. And also regarding these captivating little touches, there's a moment pretty late in the game where you encounter this shooting range. It's on a smaller ship that's crashed into the Ishimara, a ship that carried a bunch of soldiers, and as you pick through the crumbling ship, which is absolutely riddled with zombified soldiers, the game offers you this moment of respite to play with a target range. These kind of optional, non-objective minigames create immersion more than a lot of more expensive and flashy methods. I started working my way through the first round of targets, and I thought to myself that I was going to be incredibly disappointed at the game threw a reward at me. I figured the only way it thought that it would be able to retain my attention span would be some slow drip of ammo or something. And of course, I finished the round and a little platform rose with a shimmering prize on it. I completely understand the choice to give a reward, and if you complete all the levels of the little challenge you even get a power node, which is the game's upgrade currency. So it threw me into this spiral of wondering what games I had played that offered toys like this without a reward system. The thing that came to mind first was in the Wolfenstein: The New Order. In the safe house at the top floor, there's this little box of throwing knives with a target on the other side of the room, and that's it. It's the anti-objective, barely a step over static environmental supplemental dressing, but to sit there and practice throwing knives at the little target is such a pleasant experience that brings a weird, selfless existence into this fictional universe, and it added to the coziness of the safe house. I know Bioshock Infinite had something like this as well, with carnival games at the beginning that kind of worked as optional tutorials for weapons and the tonic stuff that you could use, but they also gave rewards. I think a majority of people playing these games walk right past these sections, either not noticing them or seeing them as trivial, and the ones that do seek them out generally expect to be patted on the back for walking off the beaten path. But I would love to see more games lean on the side of verisimilitude, where some of these things could be used as voluntary practice or as a bit of entertainment. This is a ridiculous complaint, if you can even call it that, because no matter what, I'm happy that Dead Space included stuff like the shooting range and the basketball court. The game hadn't really let up the tension at any point until I'd found those sections, so they gave me a chance to calm down a bit before venturing back into the heart of darkness. Even with the game's growing age, all this bleak stuff is for the most part quite pretty, but the visual fidelity isn't as fundamental as the developers' understanding of stuff like lighting, pacing, and space. The cumbersome corridors opening up into massive chasms makes the ship feel impossibly large, and the lighting in the game can be suffocating or distressingly bright. The early sequence where you're restoring power to the engines really drives home the size of the ship. The light of the machinery doesn't even illuminate the room, leaving most of the background drenched in darkness. It's oppressive and genuinely terrifying, in the same way the open ocean is terrifying. But most of the game takes place in clearly defined and decently lit rooms, so when you're thrown into the expansive space or some massive cavernous chamber, it's made doubly effective. The environments are all severely indebted to movies like Alien and Event Horizon, but also mundane things found throughout the real world. The use of skeuomorphs in sci-fi is what helps us keep believing in the fiction we're being wrapped in. A skeuomorph is something usually obsolete that is used to bring familiarity to new things, like the save icon in programs often being in the shape of a floppy disk, even though kids growing up today will likely never see a floppy disk in person. Dead Space's developers frequently refer to employing these to keep the player's disbelief strongly suspended. The desks on the Ishimara will have holographic devices sitting next to big printed textbooks, and the fact that you can recognize the books as actual objects in the real world helps bring the futuristic nonsense even closer to your reality, even though in the year 2508, books in that form will probably be long gone. These mundane inspirations are naturally what immerses the player, and the steady flow between foreign and familiar is a lot of what makes Dead Space's world so consistently noteworthy, and, more importantly, it keeps things feeling realistic and lived in. The design of the world is impressive, but the actual level design in terms of pure game flow is a huge hit and miss. The levels carry an old school pacing, just like the massive ship the game takes place on. The levels are meandering and redundant. Isaac is the errand boy of the group that crash lands on the Ishimara, the engineer that is expected to be sent into the grimy, dank corridors of the ship to fix pipes and break skulls. It's a boring narrative catalyst and an uninteresting way of explaining why Isaac is willing to do these outrageously dangerous activities. To fix this, they added Nicole, Isaac's girlfriend, who was working on the Ishimara at the time of the incident. She is a dangling carrot, obscured by fog, always just a little out of Isaac's reach, but it's extremely confusing just how nonplussed by Nicole Isaac always seems, because he's a silent protagonist. You'd assume finding her would be a huge priority for him, but he keeps just getting dragged around by the people he came with or those he runs into. It's irritating, but it stacks on the delirium that the game is trying to induce, leaving you questioning what is real and why Isaac seems so damn bored by all of it. Even if this is me just painting targets around where the arrows have landed, Nicole's inclusion in the game is certainly more fascinating than Isaac just doing his job because he's a working man and he's got to put bread on the table, even though menial labor seems to have informed the game's level pacing more than some bombastic rescue movie. It's a methodology often found in classic adventure games more than action games. Instead of block pushing and key collecting, you mostly are asked to solve physics-based puzzles. But in general, calling them puzzles is pretty generous, as they come out feeling a bit like busy work. Cleaning up a room full of asteroids, cleaning up a room full of radioactive material, replacing satellites and other commonplace jobs of a space station engineer, but the setting you're in elevates it all to bearability. There is something naturally enticing about interacting with physics in a digital space. Viscera cleanup detail expanded on that idea tenfold, and they all came out laughing. But it gets annoying to never have to use any brain power to get past these sections. They can create some amazing visuals though. Despite the simplicity of these diversions, Dead Space is still much more in line with Metroid than it is with Doom when it comes to moving the player from place to place. Levels work cyclically, with the player going to a place, doing some things, and then retracing his steps to the same platform. That works as a transition between areas in the ship and as a strange, gamey chapter closer. Retracing your steps here is a lot better of a solution in a game like this than a cutscene though. I love that they stuck to their guns and kept the game almost entirely from Isaac's perspective, even through the occasionally slow moments of moving about the ship. The missions are mostly fetch questing, and it can be kind of discouraging when you've got an endless amount of draining darkness and violence surrounding you. The fundamentals of the game's missions are dull, but the developers have pulled out a ton of tricks to keep the moment-to-moment experience fresh and exciting, even if their game world and gameplay remain pretty unflinching for most of the time. I think they kinda had to keep at least the objectives clear and simple so they could stack on as much weird stuff as possible and maintain a level of playability. The largest gimmick in their arsenal are these zero-gravity sections, which are terrible and brilliant. The camera's field of view feels pretty small, which is part of the game's claustrophobic feeling, and also not as big of a problem in third-person games as it is in first-person games. But when playing the gravity sections, I felt like I was trying to maneuver around with blinders on, and it all felt extremely cramped even if these sections always required larger, more open areas to even work. The success of these lies in their use of visual cues and largely on the objectives you're supposed to complete in them. I think when you're given a traditional objective in a relatively traditional space, and zero gravity is working as a means to traverse the world more quickly, they work really well. Later in the game, when you have to replace a bunch of broken satellites in a bowl-shaped room, launching yourself across the room in zero gravity is just a great way to quickly solve the problem and look good doing it. Earlier in the game, you have to walk across the exterior of the ship while it's being pelted by chunks of rock. You use the ability to send yourself flying in a direction to move behind cover while progressing forward. It's just a point A to point B bit of gameplay, but it's made much more interesting by the use of zero gravity and your slowly depleting oxygen supply. I think the sequences and shattered parts of the ship are incredible as well, both in their visuals and as a method to keep corridor navigation fresh, but there are certainly sections where the mechanic just fails on principle alone. One of the gravity puzzles in the hydrophonics deck of the ship is a good example. You're already on a prolonged quest trying to hunt down and kill the sources of some airborne infection, when you have to traverse a maze-like room in zero gravity. It's incredibly disorienting and infuriating, with far too few visual differences in the textures on the walls to keep yourself oriented. The walls are mostly just the same repeated infected, fleshy-looking texture that you see quite a bit in the game. And there's this rotating beam of electricity in the center of all of it. Even worse, during this, you're being attacked by those horrible baby necromorphs that hop around and often get stuck in animation loops in zero gravity. So I'm frustrated and the immersive nature of the game has been torn away from underneath me. I think the frustration of some of the zero gravity parts of the game is just symptomatic of larger issues behind some choices in Dead Space. For the most part, the fusion of horror and action in Dead Space works really well, but some of the choices seem to work against each other. Instead of strengthening, they just accentuate weaknesses in both of the genres. Horror in games can sometimes boil down to artificially limiting the player to simulate helplessness. Isaac, following in this fashion, is a pain to control through some of the more dense, complicated geometry found throughout the Ishimara. Hilariously, Isaac was actually slower in earlier builds of the game before the playtesters complained about it, which I can't even imagine. At times, especially in the terrible PC port, it feels less like controlling a character and more like just recommending movements and praying he listens. There's a reason why we don't ride horses to work anymore, and I think for a game that's supposed to last a dozen hours, some of the tankiness could have been trimmed down a bit. This is most noticeable in these zero gravity sections, where looking around never feels quite right, and as the camera jolts around with reckless abandon trying to realign itself with your character. The swingy aiming is also inconsistently implemented into the game. I love how it feels in general combat, but when the game locks the camera and makes you aim at moving objects, like the multiple sequences where Isaac is grabbed by a tentacle, it's hard to manage and feels a bit like trying to comb your hair while looking in the mirror. A major part of the final boss battle even centers around the mechanic, and it's maddening to have the game come to a halt when you die during these moments. While moving can feel a bit archaic, the animations are absolutely wonderful. Isaac's animations have weight and detail. His run has this lumbering gait, and when he's forced to walk through that fleshy, spreading infection, he slows down and moves like he's walking through sand. The facial work is great too. It's something that took me by surprise as I replayed the game. A lot of the interactions between characters in the game take place over a display that pops up in front of Isaac, and the faces are done really well and stand up against the scrutiny of taking place so prominently on the screen. The death animations of the characters and Isaac are also a delight, and one of the areas the game actually cracks a bit of a smile. All of the main characters die in terrible ways, being ripped apart or thrown into walls by monsters the size of buildings. Something incredibly clever done with a few of these deaths is how helpless they make Isaac. Almost always you're forced to watch behind a glass panel or some barrier. The game rarely puts Isaac in a position where he could touch another character, especially Nicole, who even while being in the same room is always separated from Isaac in one form or another. So when you are in close proximity to another character, things don't feel right. Dr. Kine, a man you meet in person pretty late in the game, is always either sending you transmissions or on the other side of a pane of glass. So that one moment when you're finally breathing the same air and he's standing opposite you on this long hallway, your stomach kinda sinks right before a bullet tears through his chest. The game has fun with itself in these moments, and has some callbacks to the thrilling, outrageous death scenes found in The Thing or Jaws. The rollout of the first boss is also paced very similarly to these films. Like Jaws or some classic kaiju movie, it's this buildup of excitement around what you're not seeing that's so much fun, all culminating in seeing the beast in its whole glory. It's slow, vague, and intense. You get these bits and pieces of information about its size, how it got on this ship, and you're even attacked by what you're led to believe are its own tentacles before the encounter. The bosses are all beautifully designed on top of this. All of their reveals are exciting and gorgeously choreographed. The huge buildup of the first boss is this drawn-out, tense experience, met by the sudden shock of seeing the second boss clinging to the side of the ship when the bay doors of an anti-asteroid cannon open up. The most gamey of the three in introduction is the final boss, rising out of a giant pit, arms wiggling, with a bright shining horizon gleaming in the background. It's like a Zelda boss's intro cutscene, ridiculous, biblical, and awesome. Enemy design matches this level of filmic quality. It's at times almost unmatched in the realm of gaming, and also at the same time completely derivative. But a lot of great artists call themselves thieves, so I won't dwell on it. The enemies are all basically zombies, but instead of reanimated corpses, they are a lot like repurposed corpses, with the infection not claiming some sort of allegiance to the shape and function of the human body. Much like the Thing's horrifying mutations, the monsters in the game owe their shapes and movements to insects and basic wildlife. Humanoid shapes will splatter into tiny creatures that roll and suck across the ground like detached muscles. The animation work in the enemies is unbelievable. In combat, as you cut off arms and legs, the enemies react accordingly and continue unfazed in their impossible desire to end your life. The ones that have the most dynamic, exciting animations are the ones that act most like a normal human enemy. With creatures that have really abstract shapes, I assume it was incredibly difficult for the animators to have a reference point for their dismemberment. I think the game's combat follows a pretty interesting rule though, where the more interesting an enemy is to fight, the less interesting they are to look at. The regular necromorphs, which have obvious appendages for which to aim, are a ton of fun to rip apart, but the wilder monsters that show up are notable not because of how fun they are to bring down, but just because of their terrifying looks and motions. The Weezers, who are a central part of one of the least interesting objectives in the game, are amazing. Most of their body has become this pair of lungs that just gulp down air before deflating and spewing infectious clouds out of every pore. They look like they are truly trapped in suffering. The Guardians are also great, these mother-like things glued to walls and screaming while smaller enemies drop out of them. They were kinda ruined for me after I realized they sounded a lot like the Meeseeks from Rick and Morty, but I made it through and was terrified just the same. The exploding enemies are probably the ones that shocked me the most once I actually started inspecting them. For an enemy that's just supposed to run at the player and explode, they have a ton of care put into them. They walk on fractured limbs while dragging around a massive pus-filled tumor that explodes, and their faces are split into these two clapping parts. In one of the last chapters of the game, one of them stands and stares at you through a pane of glass for a second, so clearly the developers were proud of how they turned out. I think the brutes are an exception to this rule. They're these ape-like mini-bosses and make good encounters while also being cool-looking. Killing these things is what you spend most of the game doing, so it makes sense that you'd spend a lot of time polishing them. Combat has a nice flow. Unlike most contemporary action games, there aren't many ways to effectively fight your enemies while moving away from them, forcing you to sprint with your back to them or face them head-on and tactically slow them down before they can reach you. Isaac's weapon set is mostly composed of the tools of the blue-collar space miner, a bunch of high-tech versions of shovels and drills and such. There's a reasonable explanation of how every weapon Isaac uses can be found on the Ishimara. Of course, these miners would require numerous high-tech cutting tools as they rip apart these titanic chunks of rock, but at the same time, they're all suspiciously well suited for the task at hand. Even the single true weapon of the bunch has a crowd control feature, and fires a tight 3-bullet spread. It's a conscious decision to keep the action unique to the world of Dead Space, as they are all hilariously tailor-fit to the situation Isaac has found himself in. Pretty much all of the weapons are noteworthy. The most iconic of them, and the one that has proven to have a long pop culture lifespan, is the plasma cutter. It's such a hyper-focused example of Dead Space's unique approach to combat. Its practical use in the world was to trim down misshapen rocks before being smelted. Its horizontal and vertical firing pattern is immediately recognizable, and endlessly effective in cutting the limbs off of the enemies you fight. There is a bit of an overlap between the plasma cutter's uses and the line gun, the latter of which at first seems like a larger, more powerful version of the former. After using it for a bit though, its flaws begin to surface. It's extremely useful when fighting multiple enemies, but its ammo stacks are small, which makes reloading frequent and ends up topping off your inventory far too quickly. The weapon that is the most economical when it comes to inventory space is the pulse rifle, which is the only weapon in the game that is actually a weapon. I consider the pulse rifle to be the second best on offer here, even if it isn't necessarily as fun as using the other weapons. There's a scrappiness and brutality in the combat that's lost when using the rifle, but that never became a reason enough for it to leave my inventory. The only one of them that breaks the rules of the weapon set is the flamethrower, which you can just wildly flail about, spraying damage in a general direction before the enemies you're shooting at just kind of slowly fall apart. It's a boring weapon to use, mostly useless, and doesn't require much effort or accuracy on the player's end. It falls into that terrible position of being extremely situational, only being helpful when hordes of small or legless enemies are encroaching on you. And for the most players' first time through the game, you aren't aware of what lies ahead of you, so why waste one of your 4 weapon slots on the thing? The rollout of the weapons is pretty quick. They try to get them all in your hands so you can find a few favorites and begin upgrading them. I'm really thankful for this, and I think the choice to have your suit and your weapons all require the same upgrade currency balances things out and ensures that you can never make an easy decision at the upgrade bench. The developers seemed like they were at a bit of a crossroads though when designing the guns and how the ammunition was going to be managed. A big part of the balancing of the guns was focusing on how large the ammo stacks in your inventory were, but sometimes these seemed kind of nonsensical. A fully upgraded pulse rifle does an absolutely massive amount of damage when compared to the other weapons, while also being able to have 100 round stacks because it's fully automatic. It makes sense. The line gun, on the other hand, can only have stacks of 6 rounds. These single rounds of ammo can do a ton of damage and even be converted into an explosive, but it's completely impractical to keep this gun as your primary weapon because the ammo it uses clogs your inventory so damn quickly and doesn't provide the same damage output as the pulse rifle. The two would be hard to compare in a lot of games, but in Dead Space the gun count is extremely small, and ammo is really scarce on higher difficulties, so it's something that should have been taken into account. Another thing that needs to be said is regarding their visual design, which is all over the place. It makes sense that they all look like they just got dragged from the bed of the futuristic equivalent of an F-150, dirt splattered and rusted, but a lot of their appearances and their manner of affecting elements of the user experience, like the crosshair and positioning of the camera, isn't totally indicative of how the weapon is going to perform. The plasma cutter comes out really clean here. When shouldered, the camera tucks up high and the crosshair perfectly illustrates the path of your projectiles. The look of the gun informs this as well. It looks like a futuristic nail gun, and when the player transitions the firing pattern, the tip of the gun quickly rotates. But then you have something like the contact beam, which I guess looks like something that's about to fire a big laser, but when you prep the weapon for firing, the camera sinks low and the crosshair's appearance is a tight line of 3 dots. When the camera sinks low, it doesn't really imply accuracy, and the contact point of the laser doesn't do much splash damage, so in times of stress, your margin of error is pretty small for a weapon that takes a while to fire again. I think the crosshair choice is really strange. A triangular shape of dots, like the pulse rifles, would have worked a lot better. Using the weapon feels more awkward as a result. I think awkward is a good way to describe Dead Space as a whole. It was this brave kid of a game that stepped onto the market all lanky and weird, stepping on the toes of gods like Resident Evil 4. But what people saw after playing the game was one hell of a franchise debut. One that worked perfectly as a single package but left doors open for future installations. Future installations that thousands of fans immediately began pining for. They would have to wait 3 years for the next true game in the series.
It spoke to me.
A game
What
that
did
was
it
going to
say,
take the
Isaac?
Dead Space universe
What did it say to you, Isaac?
strange and terrifying.